Welcome to Christopher Reed's. Tonight's presentation, Verdugo, by Honor de Balzac, translated by Ellen Marriage. Midnight had just sounded from the belfry tower of the little town of Menda. A young French officer, leaning over the parapet of the long terrace at the further end of the castle gardens, seemed to be unusually absorbed in deep thought for one who led the reckless life of a soldier. But it must be admitted that never was the hour, the scene, and the night more favorable to meditation. The blue dome of the cloudless sky of Spain was overhead. He was looking out over the coy windings of a lovely valley, lit by the uncertain starlight and the soft radiance of the moon. The officer, leaning against an orange tree in blossom, could also see 100 feet below him the town of Menda, which seemed to nestle for shelter from the north wind at the foot of the crags on which the castle itself was built. He turned his head and caught sight of the sea. The moonlit waves made a broad frame of silver for the landscape. There were lights in the castle windows, the mirth and movement of a ball, the sounds of the violins, the laughter of the officers and their partners in the dance, was borne towards him and blended with the far-off murmur of the waves. The cool night had a certain bracing effect upon his frame, wearied as he had been by the heat of the day. He seemed to bathe in the air, made fragrant by the strong, sweet scent of flowers and of aromatic trees in the gardens. The castle of Menda belonged to a Spanish grande, who was living in it at the time with his family. All through the evening, the oldest daughter of the house had watched the officer with such a wistful interest that the Spanish lady's compassionate eyes might well have set the young Frenchman dreaming. Clara was beautiful, and although she had 3 brothers and a sister, the broad lands of the Marquès de Leganes appeared to be sufficient warrant for Victor Martian's belief that the young lady would have a splendid dowry. But how could he dare to imagine that the most fanatical believer in blue blood in all Spain would give his daughter to the son of a grocer in Paris? Moreover, the French were hated. It was because the Marquis had been suspected of an attempt to raise the country in favor of Ferdinand VII that General G, who governed the province, had stationed Victor Martian's battalion in the little town of Menda to overawe the neighboring districts, which received the Marquès de Leganes' word as law. A recent dispatch from Marshal Ney had given ground for fear that the English might ere long effect a landing on the coast, and had indicated the Marquis as being in correspondence with the cabinet in London. In spite, therefore, of the welcome with which the Spaniards had received Victor Martian and his soldiers, that officer was always on his guard. As he went towards the terrace, where he had just surveyed the town and the districts confided to his charge, he had been asking himself what construction he ought to put upon the friendliness which the Marquis had invariably shown him, and how to reconcile the apparent tranquillity of the country with his general's uneasiness. But a moment later these thoughts were driven from his mind by the instinct of caution and very legitimate curiosity. It had just struck him that there was a very fair number of lights in the town below. Although it was the feast of St. James, he himself had issued orders that very morning that all lights must be put out in the town at the hour prescribed by military regulations. The castle alone had been excepted in this order. Plainly here and there he saw the gleam of bayonets, where his own men were at their accustomed posts. But in the town there was a solemn silence, and not a sign that the Spaniards had given themselves up to the intoxication of a festival. He tried vainly for a while to explain this breach of the regulations on the part of the inhabitants. The mystery seemed but so much the more obscure because he had left instructions with some of his officers to do police duty that night and make the rounds of the town. With the impetuosity of youth, He was about to spring through a gap in the wall preparatory to a rapid scramble down the rocks, thinking to reach a small guardhouse at the nearest entrance into the town more quickly than by the beaten track, when a faint sound stopped him. He fancied that he could hear the light footstep of a woman along the gravelled garden walk. He turned his head and saw no one. For one moment his eyes were dazzled by the wonderful brightness of the sea. The next he saw a sight so ominous that he stood stock still with amazement, thinking that his senses must be deceiving him. The white moonbeams lighted the horizon, so that he could distinguish the sails of ships still a considerable distance out at sea. A shudder ran through him. He tried to persuade himself that this was some optical illusion brought about by chance effects of moonlight on the waves. Even as he made the attempt, a hoarse voice called to him by name. The officer glanced at the gap in the wall, saw a soldier's head slowly emerge from it, and knew the grenadier whom he had ordered to accompany him to the castle. "Is that you, Commandant?" "Yes. What is it?" returned the young officer in a low voice. A kind of presentiment warned him to act cautiously. "Those beggars down there are creeping about like worms, and by your leave, I came as quickly as I could to report my little reconnoitering expedition." "Go on," answered Victor Marchand. "I have just been following a man from the castle who came round this way with a lantern in his hand. A lantern is a suspicious matter with a vengeance. I don't imagine that there was any need for that good Christian to be lighting tapers at the time of night. Says I to myself, they mean to gobble us up. And I set myself to dogging his heels. And that is how I found out that there is a pile of faggots, sir, 2 or 3 steps away from here." Suddenly a dreadful shriek rang through the town below and cut the man short. A light flashed in the commandant's face, and the poor grenadier dropped down with a bullet through his head. 10 paces away, a bonfire flared up like a conflagration. The sounds of music and laughter ceased all at once in the ballroom. The silence of death, broken only by groans, succeeded to the rhythmical murmur of the festival. Then the roar of cannon sounded from across the white plain of the sea. A cold sweat broke out on the young officer's forehead. He had left his sword behind. He knew that his men had been murdered, that the English were about to land. He knew that if he lived he would be dishonored. He saw himself summoned before a court-martial. For a moment his eyes measured the depth of the valley. The next, just as he was about to spring down, Clara's hand caught his. "Fly," she cried. "My brothers are coming after me to kill you. Down yonder at the foot of the cliff you will find Juanito's Andalusian. Go!" She thrust him away. The young man gazed at her in dull bewilderment, but obeying the instinct of self-preservation, which never deserts even the bravest, he rushed across the park in the direction pointed out to him, springing from rock to rock in places unknown to any save the goats. He heard Clara calling to her brothers to pursue him, heard their balls whistling about his ears, but he reached the foot of the cliff, found the horse, mounted, and fled with lightning speed. A few hours later, the young officer reached General G's quarters and found him at dinner with the staff. "I put my life in your hands," cried the haggard and exhausted commandant of Menda. He sank into a seat and told his horrible story. It was received with an appalling silence. "It seems to me that you are more to be pitied than to blame," the terrible general said at last. "You are not answerable for the Spaniards' crimes, and unless the marshal decides otherwise, I acquit you." These words brought but cold comfort to the unfortunate officer. "When the emperor comes to hear about it," he cried. "Ah, he will be for having you shot," said the general. "But we shall see. Now we will say no more about this." He added severely, "Except to plan a revenge that shall strike a salutary terror into this country, where they carry on war like savages." An hour later, a whole regiment, a detachment of cavalry, and a convoy of artillery were upon the road. The general and Victor marched at the head of the column. The soldiers had been told of the fate of their comrades, and their rage knew no bounds. The distance between headquarters and the town of Menda was crossed at a well-nigh miraculous speed. Whole villages by the way were found to be under arms. Every one of the wretched hamlets was surrounded, and their inhabitants decimated. It so chanced that the English vessels still lay out at sea, and were no nearer the shore, a fact inexplicable until it was known afterwards that they were artillery transports which had outsailed the rest of the fleet. So the townsmen of Menda, left without the assistance on which they had reckoned when the sails of the English appeared, were surrounded by French troops almost before they had had time to strike a blow. This struck such terror into them that they offered to surrender at discretion. An impulse of devotion, no isolated instance in the history of the peninsula, led the actual slayers of the French to offer to give themselves up, seeking in this way to save the town, for from the general's reputation for cruelty, it was feared that he would give Menda over to the flames and put the whole population to the sword. General G took their offer, stipulating that every soul in the castle, from the lowest servant to the marquis, should likewise be given up to him. These terms being accepted, the general promised to spare the lives of the rest of the townsmen and to prohibit his soldiers from pillaging or setting fire to the town. A heavy contribution was levied, and the wealthiest inhabitants were taken as hostages to guarantee payment within 24 hours. The general took every necessary precaution for the safety of his troops, provided for the defense of the place, and refused to billet his men in the houses of the town. After they had bivouacked, he went up to the castle and entered it as a conqueror. The whole family of the Ligonias and their household were gagged, shut up in the great ballroom, and closely watched. From the windows it was easy to see the whole length of the terrace above the town. The staff was established in an adjoining gallery, where the general forthwith held a council as to the best means of preventing the landing of the English. An aide de camp was dispatched to Marshal Ney. Orders were issued to place batteries along the coast, and then the general and his staff turned their attention to their prisoners. The 200 Spaniards, given up by the townsfolk, were shot down then and there upon the terrace. And after this military execution, the general gave orders to erect gibbets to the number of the prisoners in the ballroom in the same place, and to send for the hangman out of the town. Victor took advantage of the interval before dinner to pay a visit to the prisoners. He soon came back to the general. "I am come in haste," he faltered out, "to ask a favor." "You?" exclaimed the general, with bitter irony in his tones. "Alas," answered Victor, "it is a sorry favor. The Marquis has seen them erecting the gallows, and hopes that you will commute the punishment for his family. He entreats you to have the nobles beheaded." "Granted," said the general. He further asks that they may be allowed the consolations of religion, and that they may be unbound. They give you their word that they will not attempt to escape." "That I permit," said the general, "but you are answerable for them. The old noble offers you all that he has, if you will pardon his youngest son." "Really?" cried the commander. "His property, is forfeit already to King Joseph." He paused. A contemptuous thought set wrinkles in his forehead as he added, "I will do better than they ask. I understand what he means by that last request of his. Very good. Let him hand down his name to posterity. But whenever it is mentioned, all Spain shall remember his treason and its punishment. I will give the fortune and his life to any one of the sons who will do the executioner's office. There, don't talk any more about them to me." Dinner was ready. The officers sat down to satisfy an appetite whetted by hunger. Only one among them was absent from the table. That one was Victor Marchand. After long hesitation, he went to the ballroom and heard the last sighs of the proud house of Ligoniers. He looked sadly at the scene before him. Only last night, in this very room, he had seen their faces whirled past him in the waltz, and he shuddered to think that those girlish heads with those of the three young brothers must fall in a brief space by the executioner's sword. There sat the father and mother, their 3 sons and 2 daughters, perfectly motionless, bound to their gilded chairs. 8 serving men stood with their hands tied behind them. These 15 prisoners, under sentence of death, exchanged grave glances. It was difficult to read the thoughts that filled them from their eyes, but profound resignation and regret that their enterprise should have failed so completely was written on more than one brow. The impassive soldiers who guarded them respected the grief of their bitter enemies. A gleam of curiosity lighted up all faces when Victor came in. He gave orders that the condemned prisoners should be unbound, and himself unfastened the cords that held Clara a prisoner. She smiled mournfully at him. The officer could not refrain from lightly touching the young girl's arm. He could not help admiring her dark hair, her slender waist. She was a true daughter of Spain, with a Spanish complexion, a Spaniard's eyes, blacker than the raven's wing beneath their long, curving lashes. "Did you succeed?" she asked, with a mournful smile, in which a certain girlish charm still lingered. Victor could not repress a groan. He looked from the faces of the 3 brothers to Clara, and again at the 3 young Spaniards. The first, the oldest of the family, was a man of 30. He was short and somewhat ill-made. He looked haughty and proud, but a certain distinction was not lacking in his bearing, and he was apparently no stranger to the delicacy of feeling for which in olden times the chivalry of Spain was famous. His name was Juanito. The second son, Philippe, was about 20 years of age. He was like his sister Clara, and the youngest was a child of 8. In the features of the little Manuel, a painter could have discerned something of that Roman steadfastness which David has given to the children's faces in his Republican genre pictures. The old Marquis, with his white hair, might have come down from some canvas of Murillo's. Victor threw back his head in despair after the survey. How should one of these accept the general's offer? Nevertheless, he ventured to entrust it to Clara. A shudder ran through the Spanish girl, but she recovered herself almost instantly and knelt before her father. "Father," she said, "bid Juanito swear to obey the commands that you shall give him, and we shall be content." The Marquesa trembled with hope, but as she leant towards her husband and learned Clara's hideous secret, the mother fainted away. Juanito understood it all and leapt up like a caged lion. Victor took it upon himself to dismiss the soldiers after receiving an assurance of entire submission from the Marquis. The servants were led away and given over to the hangman and their fate. When only Victor remained on guard in the room, the old Marquez de Leganez rose to his feet. "Juanito," he said. For all answer, Juanito bowed his head in a way that meant refusal. He sank down into his chair and fixed tearless eyes upon his father and mother in an intolerable gaze. Clara went over to him and sat on his knee. She put her arms about him and pressed kisses on his eyelids, saying gaily, "Dear Juanito, but if you but knew how sweet death at your hands will be to me, I shall not be compelled to submit to the hateful touch of the hangman's fingers. You will snatch me away from the evils to come, and, dear, kind Juanito, you could not bear the thought of my belonging to anyone. Well, then?" The velvet eyes gave Victor a burning glance. She seemed to try to awaken in Juanito's heart his hatred for the French. "Take courage," said his brother Philippe, "or our well-nigh royal line will be extinct." Suddenly Clara sprang to her feet. The group round Juanito fell back, and the son who had rebelled with such good reason was confronted with his aged father. "Juanito, I command you," said the Marquis solemnly. The young Count gave no sign, and his father fell on his knees. Clara, Manuel, and Philippe unconsciously followed his example, stretching out suppliant hands to him who must save their family from oblivion, and seeming to echo their father's words. "Can it be that you lack the fortitude of a Spaniard and true sensibility, my son? Do you mean to keep me on my knees? What right have you to think of your own life and of your own sufferings? Is this my son, madame?" The old Marquis added, turning to his wife. "He will consent to it," cried the mother in agony of soul. She had seen a slight contraction of Juanito's brows, which she, his mother, alone understood. Mariquita, the second daughter, knelt with her slender arms clinging about her mother. The hot tears fell from her eyes, and her little brother Manuel upbraided her for weeping. Just at that moment the castle chaplain came in. The whole family surrounded him and led him up to Juanito. Victor felt that he could endure the sight no longer, and with a sign to Clara, he hurried from the room to make one last effort for them. He found the general in boisterous spirits. The officers were still sitting over their dinner and drinking together. The wine had loosened their tongues. An hour later, 100 of the principal citizens of Menda were summoned to the terrace by the general's orders to witness the execution of the family of Leganez. A detachment had been told off to keep order among the Spanish townsfolk who were marshaled beneath the gallows whereon the Marquis's servants hung. The feet of those martyrs of their cause all but touched the citizens' heads. 30 paces away stood the block. The blade of a scimitar glittered upon it, and the executioner stood by, in case Juanito should refuse at the last. The deepest silence prevailed, but before long it was broken by the sound of many footsteps, the measured tramp of a picket of soldiers, and the jingling of their weapons. Mingled with these came other noises, loud talk and laughter from the dinner table where the officers were sitting. Just as the music and the sound of the dancers' feet had drowned the preparations for last night's treacherous butchery. All eyes turned to the castle and beheld the family of nobles coming forth with incredible composure to their death. Every brow was serene and calm. One alone among them, haggard and overcome, leant on the arm of the priest, who poured forth all the consolations of religion for the one man who was condemned to live. Then the executioner, like the spectators, knew that Juanito had consented to perform his office for a day. The old Marquis and his wife, Clara and Mariquita, and their 2 brothers knelt a few paces from the fatal spot. Juanito reached it, guided by the priest. As he stood at the block, the executioner plucked him by the sleeve and took him aside, probably to give him certain instructions. The confessor so placed the victims that they could not witness the executions, but one and all stood upright and fearless, like Spaniards as they were. Clara sprang to her brother's side before the others. "Juanito," she said to him, "be merciful to my lack of courage. Take me first." As she spoke, the footsteps of a man running at full speed echoed from the walls, and Victor appeared upon the scene. Clara was kneeling before the block. Her white neck seemed to appeal to the blade to fall. The officer turned faint, but he found strength to rush to her side. "The general grants you your life if you will consent to marry me," he murmured. The Spanish girl gave the officer a glance full of proud disdain. "Now, Juanito," she said in her deep-toned voice. Her head fell at Victor's feet. A shudder ran through the Marquesa de Logroñez, a convulsive tremor that she could not control, but she gave no other sign of her anguish. "Is this where I ought to be, dear Juanito? Is it all right?" little Manuel asked his brother. "Oh, Mariquita, you are weeping," Juanito said when his sister came. "Yes," said the girl. "I am thinking of you, poor Juanito. How unhappy you will be when we are gone." Then the Marquis's tall figure approached. He looked at the block where his children's blood had been shed, turned to the mute and motionless crowd, and said in a loud voice, as he stretched out his hand to Juanito, "Spaniards, I give my son a father's blessing. Now, Marquis, strike without fear. Thou art without reproach." But when his mother came near, leaning on the confessor's arm, "She fed me from her breast," Juanito cried, in tones that drew a cry of horror from the crowd. The uproarious mirth of the officers over their wine died away before that terrible cry. The Marquesa knew that Juanito's courage was exhausted. At one bound, she sprang to the balustrade, leapt forth, and was dashed to pieces on the rocks below. A cry of admiration broke from the spectators. Juanito swooned. "General," said an officer, half drunk by this time, "Martian has just been telling me something about this execution. I will wager that it was not by your orders. Are you forgetting, gentlemen, that in a month's time 500 families in France will be in mourning, and that we are still in Spain?" cried General G. "Do you want us to leave our bones here?" But not a man at the table, not even a subaltern, dared to empty his glass after that speech. In spite of the respect in which all men hold the Marquis de Logroñez, in spite of the title of El Verdugo, the executioner, conferred upon him as a patent of nobility by the King of Spain, The great noble is consumed by a gnawing grief. He lives a retired life, seldom appears in public. The burden of his heroic crime weighs heavily upon him, and he seems to wait impatiently till the birth of a second son shall release him, and he may go to join the shades that never cease to haunt him. This concludes tonight's reading. El Verdugo by Honor de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. Narrated by Christopher Reeves.